Hello everyone, welcome to week 5 of Social Justice and the Natural World. My name is Anastasia Mortimer and I'll be giving this week's lecture on disasters and social justice. Just a little bit about me. I have already said this before, but I'm a former lecturer at Notre Dame, currently working at the Centre of Western Sydney at Western Sydney University. My research background is focused on climate change disasters, looking at the impacts of disasters on humans, specifically around the issues of displacement and human mobility. Today's lecture, I'll focus on concepts of what constitutes a disaster and also the theoretical foundations for understanding disasters from a social justice standpoint. So when we think about disasters, we need to think about what is a disaster. And this might seem like a very simplistic question, but depending on your discipline or background, this standpoint differs. So regardless of the standpoint, a disaster as it is known now refers to a sudden, overwhelming and unforeseen event. Not all calamities are disasters. A disaster is specific in the sense that it comes to fruition when a shock event causes serious human, material, economic or environmental loss. And whilst there is unity on understanding that disasters are an outcome of mass loss and devastation, the notion of what causes a disaster is still up for debate. So how disasters have traditionally been understood is that they are acts of God, fate or luck, and this approach has dominated thinking around disasters since the 1900s. But however, it has since been replaced with a more scientific description of disaster, which sees disasters as synonymous with the event itself. So this is the idea that a disaster is caused by nature, and it has been used throughout scientific disciplines as a focus on the event itself. For example, a disaster is a cyclone, a disaster is a flood. This is a very hazard-centric view that focuses on environmental risk and argues that hazards become disasters, and this focus is based on the underlying geophysical process. However, we're social scientists and therefore need to think about disasters in a social way. And this form of thinking started to come to fruition in the 1980s when the scientific perspective, which claimed the naturalness of natural disasters, began to be challenged by a variety of social scientists who argued for the need for consideration of the underlying human drivers for catastrophe. So this social science perspective saw patterns in the unequal distribution of natural hazards and also the exposure that pointed to human man-made causes in distribution and effects of disasters. Tying it back to the week on environmental justice, you can start to see the same sort of language being used there about distribution and effect. So this is the perspective that disasters are a consequence of humans. They are the acts of humans that cause disasters. And this is in the sense that disasters are a result of human actions or inactions. Under this idea, many disasters would not have occurred or would have been smaller in impact if they had not been as a result of human decision making. For example, deforestation has resulted in landslides during heavy rainfall in Central and South America. Overgrazing of cattle has allowed for desertification in a variety of areas in Sub-Saharan Africa. And uncontrolled housing construction close to beaches increases the risk of tsunamis and coastal storm inundation. The removal of mangroves in Northern Australia has eliminated natural buffers against cyclones. So all of these decisions have increased the disaster risk and therefore are going to lead to more human-related loss. Under this perspective, there is also recognition that structural factors such as increasing poverty and related social processes accounted for people and societies to become vulnerable to disasters. So this has led to the introduction of the social vulnerability framework to disasters, which touched at the understanding of disasters as social phenomena. So whereas disasters used to be practically equated to natural hazards, they have now become understood to be the interaction between hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So we'll talk about this later. So disaster risk is hazard plus vulnerability plus exposure. That means, just in summary, that you have the natural event, you have the social vulnerability risk factors, and you have the rate of exposure based off your geographic location to disasters, which then leads to a disaster. And so these are the main standpoints that we see now from a social sciences perspective, that disasters are social phenomena, not natural. So underpinning this idea is that there would be no natural disasters if it were not for humans. Without humans, these are only natural events. And what this is saying is that while there are these processes that have been operating throughout Earth's history, such as weather systems, such as geophysical processes, such as tides, such as wind speeds, hazards have become hazardous because they now affect us as human beings and our infrastructure. The way disasters are defined are in anthropocentric terms. Within the definition of disaster, an event can only be a disaster if it causes impact to human beings. For example, loss of life, property, or significant economic impacts. And until there is mass casualties, until there is mass building destructions on property or large-scale economic losses as a result of a natural hazard, it will not be classified as a disaster. It would just be classified as a hazardous event. While environmental impacts are acknowledged in understandings of disasters, primarily they are understood in terms of secondary loss from natural resources. For example, if we look at the recent mangrove dieback that happened in Northern Australia's Gulf of Carpentaria, this was a loss of the world's largest mangrove forest, stretching over 200,000 kilometres as a result of marine heat waves in the region caused by climate change. However, this had very little direct human-related loss because the area is largely uninhabited for the majority of the year. And therefore, while it was devastating, it's not classified as a disaster because it did not have direct human impacts. And this really reiterates the anthropogenic focus of a disaster. It's important to question whether this is the correct way to view disasters and also to challenge these anthropocentric notions in a social justice lens. So think about this in terms of that. Think about the various different philosophies covered in weeks 1 and 2 and how this would challenge these sort of anthropogenic conceptualizations of how we classify what is a hazard and what is a natural disaster. Again, from a sociological standpoint, disasters are not natural. They are always a result of human impact. So I also just wanted to highlight that there are different ways in which disasters are typically categorized. So they either fall into the category of a hazard that is human-made as a result of human error, as a result of human intervention with nature, or natural hazards. So these are typically the two causal factors that might lead to a disaster. So a human disaster would be something like greenhouse gas effect, deforestation, or, uncontrolled town planning that leads to an abundance of infrastructure that might be vulnerable to other types of hazards. So these are human-made disasters. There might also be things like oil spills, nuclear war. These are all things that come from human intervention with nature or human consequences. Then there are natural phenomenon-based hazards. These might be biological in the sense that they are a result of a pandemic or infectious diseases. They might be geophysical. in the sense that it comes from a geophysical type event, such as an earthquake. They could be hydrological because of a flood, and also meteorological, which comes from various phenomena such as wind and rain leading to severe storm. Then we have climatological, and these are the natural hazards that emerge directly from climate change. And these two hazard types can be exemplified in how they interact and drive disaster in the example of the Japan's earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster of 2011. So there was an earthquake and tsunami that led to storm surge inundation to a nuclear facility in Fukushima, Japan in 2011 that led to a nuclear reaction. The impact of that, you can see, stemmed from originally an earthquake, which is a geophysical phenomena, leading to tsunami, which is a hydrological disaster, leading to an industrial accident or technological accident as a result of the tsunami impacting the nuclear facility, of which was devastating consequences of the people of Fukushima. And I just wanted to highlight the natural hazards are naturally occurring physical, environmental, or weather-based phenomena. They occur naturally in our environments. They are a natural part of our ecosystem function. However, like I've mentioned previously, that these are getting exacerbated from issues such as climate change. Researchers such as myself question whether natural hazards are natural in the age of climate change, given that they are becoming more frequent, intense, and unpredictable as a result of climate change, which is anthropogenic in nature. However, we know that these things exist with or without humans, but they only become a disaster as a result of human decision making. For example, decisions to build homes in a floodplain lead to a disaster. Decisions to build homes in a high risk area to bushfires lead to disaster. Poor building standards in areas highly exposed to cyclones, such as the example of Cyclone Tracy in Darwin, led to a disaster. And so a natural hazard becomes a disaster when it has these severe impacts, an impact of which can be initial events such as housing loss. When you build infrastructure or human settlements in a place where there is disaster, you will have widespread loss, whether that be loss of life, whether that be loss of property, and also mental health as a result of the trauma. However, there are secondary losses also that need to be accounted for. These include displacement, ecosystem loss, community breakdown, and also poverty as a result of losing all of your assets. And this is something that we're going to talk more about in terms of the perspective of disaster justice. Now, to contrast that with human-made disasters that come from human-made hazards, an example of this would be pollution. So the dumping of pollutants in water sources is an example. It could be things such as lead poisoning in water in Flint, Michigan, or in Love Canal, which is a very famous example of an environmental justice case where we saw the pollution happening in water supply there that caused toxic chemicals and cancer for the population. There's also technological hazards, which come from inventing new technologies that lead to mass human destruction. An example of this is the dropping of atomic bombs during World War II. So this, using technology to intentionally cause disaster, devastated areas of Japan, such as Hiroshima and Fukushima. Then there are just accidents. They don't intentionally happen. This might be things like oil spills in the ocean. They're a result of human decision making, which led to an accident, but these accidents led to widespread destruction and disaster, specifically for natural ecosystems, but also on human beings in the sense that it damages our food sources and marine life. Then there's just general environmental degradation. So these arise from the consequences of long-term environmental pollution. This might include greenhouse gas effect as a result of various natural resource-based pollution that has destructed the ozone layer and led to also CO2 emissions, leading to climate change. These are all factors which we can categorize as human-made disasters. Yeah, and I just want to highlight, however, that researchers aren't always keen to differentiate disasters in the terms of human and non-human forms of disaster. And this is because when we look at many public health emergencies in recent years, we can see that epidemic outbreaks are traced back to foreign animal viral disease that transcend human beings. However, things such as deforestation, things such as animal agriculture or animal-based industries actually contribute to disease outbreaks as a result of inadequate human and animal relations. So man-made factors such as the wildlife trade, land conversion and industrial development, industrial farming, and growth in urbanization globally are contributing to the increased frequency of novel zoonotic diseases. And therefore, many people in this field suggest that is it truly natural when these are results of human-made environmental issues that lead to hazards, such as the coronavirus pandemic. So human encroachment on nature brought people closer to animals, which increased the likelihood of human infection and led to mass disease outbreak as a result of globalization and the ability for human beings to travel great distances and continents in a short number of hours over an airplane, for example. So this has led to researchers to point out that globalization, which is a human phenomenon, can be linked to the risk of these human infections. And there has been no other point in human history that human populations have been so interconnected through these transportations, which has essentially allowed for the pathogens and viral pathogens, to travel around the world in a matter of hours. And so therefore, the distinction between what's natural and what's human-made is continually being blurred as we develop in terms of our global networks and as we develop technologically. And so when we look at this example, we can see that COVID is an example of a biological hazard resulting in a disaster, but it is not necessarily accurate to see it as entirely natural. So within current disaster studies, literature and practice, especially practice that occurs at the international disaster relief level, there is this understanding of the sociological understanding of disasters, which sees disasters as thoroughly embedded within sociological phenomena. It suggests that the traditional approach of seeing disasters as causally related to environmental factors is deterministic, and that instead we need to consider the underlying social, structural, cultural, and political factors that actually contribute to the underlying conditions for which a disaster occurred. And so this sociological thinking is focused on how these processes contribute to the likelihood of who is going to be impacted by a disaster, who gets to recover in the aftermath of disaster, and also the reasons why certain groups are routinely being impacted by disaster. What you're probably aware of when you think about it from a social justice lens, that disasters exist in the greater social system in which we live. And so we have disasters, and they are in itself a hazardous event, but the people impacted by disasters also face interconnecting inequality, such as poverty, such as marginalization, such as historical injustices, such as a denial of human rights. These are the same people who are likely to be more impacted by a disaster, and that comes back to our unequal distribution of environmental burden that we covered in discussions of environmental justice. The human environment interactions that exist in a disaster also exist in everyday society, and the inequality of everyday society is just exacerbated pre and post disaster. And so we need to think about how disasters are fundamentally social processes that are a result of these unjust phenomena. And this thinking, as I said, is becoming more widely accepted, particularly when we think about disaster impacts that demonstrate these levels of inequality, social inequality, political inequality, and economic inequality that exist in everyday life and are replicated in disaster scenarios. In building on that sociological understanding is the idea of social vulnerability, which is very much focused on the structural determinants of who is likely to face impact as a result of a disaster. And it's this idea that the people who are most vulnerable to disasters are those who are physically vulnerable as a result of the locations in which they live, who are socially vulnerable as a result of facing social marginalisation. They also might be economically vulnerable, as in not have the capital to prepare for, to mitigate or recover from a disaster. They also might have limited coping capacity. They might not have strong networks or community ties that can support them in the aftermath of a disaster. And that is the focus on vulnerability. However, vulnerability under this theory intersects with two other phenomena that actually lead to the likelihood of a disaster to occur. So we actually have the hazard, which is the dangerous environmental phenomena. That is those climatological, hydrological, or man-made hazards that actually are the event itself, which might contribute to someone experiencing a disaster. But then there's the exposure. So that's things such as the structures in which we live. It's the size of our population. It's the assets that we own. These, when they're exposed, and someone is vulnerable, that is when we have high levels of risk of disaster. And that's where often disasters lead to widespread loss and destruction. Again, the people who are most likely to experience these loss are those who have pre-existing marginality in our societies. So when we look at the majority world, where most disasters occur in the global south or in the context of low-income developing nations that already have pre-existing issues of poverty or weak governance systems, the people most impacted by disaster are often women and children. When we think about also people who are most impacted by disasters, it's people who have disability. And an intersecting factor between all of this is that it's often people who are also experiencing extreme poverty. And the reason for that is because they do not have the capital to overcome the disaster event after the fact. And so all of this contribute to how a disaster becomes a disaster. Underpinning this disaster vulnerability perspective is the idea that vulnerability incorporates both proneness or liabilities and our human capacities. We all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. So regardless of if you are experiencing poverty or if you are financially secure, you will have some capacity to cope in a crisis, but you also have some liabilities that might inhibit you from having the capacity to cope. So it is important to think about these multiple dimensions when we consider disaster vulnerability. However, as you can see up on this diagram on the screen, those who are vulnerable and those who are resilient are shaped by structures which essentially protect people from harm on the one hand and expose people on the other. So this inequity is an issue of disaster justice. So as mentioned, it's because those with pre-existing marginality or exclusion are going to be the most at risk or prone to disaster-related loss. We'll talk more about this in tutorials, where I'll also have a guest lecture based off my PhD research for you on the Black Summer bushfires. But I just wanted to preface that here are some references and further reading if you are interested in this topic for your assessments. As mentioned, please always feel free to reach out to me if you have any direct questions about these topics. I'd be happy to answer questions, and good luck. Thank you.